The technology and strategy of war is constantly changing, and has been since the beginning of time. War affects everything from politics to economics, and it is crucial to learn about it if you want to understand history. In this video, we will be going through a brief history of the way the weapons, strategy, and tactics of war in Europe have changed since 1450. 1453 signaled the end of the Hundred Years' War, a series of conflicts between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England. There were two outstanding technological features of the Hundred Years' War that affected it greatly, the main being the English longbow. The French did not use longbows and preferred to stock their armies with crossbows. The longbow's rate of fire and penetration power negated the French superiority of numbers and resources. The second was the use of artillery. By the end of the war, traditional military sieges of towns were not necessary, as leaders would usually surrender as soon as the artillery train was deployed. Because of these technological advances, the power of the mounted knight finally came to an end. The next 300 years saw monumental changes in the way that land warfare was conducted, from the size and arrangements of armies to vastly improved weapons and new military strategies. With the dawn of the Renaissance, many ancient traditions were revived, most notably Roman military tactics. Troops were deployed in straight lines, and there was an imposition of geometrical patterns upon military architecture. Roman influence can also be seen in the organization of troops into units. The use of gunpowder also prompted changes in land warfare. The proportion of infantry to cavalry increased due to the advantage of firearms, which needed very little training to use but caused unprecedented levels of destruction. A musket from the 1540s could pierce armor at 200 yards. By the turn of the 15th century, swordsmen were no longer a significant part of land armies. As these new advances in technology developed, so did tactics alongside them. A growing emphasis was placed on siege warfare, blockades, and attrition, as opposed to traditional assaults. The pace of war became slower as seasonal warfare ended. Fortification and defenses were strengthened with the development of the angled bastion, a new way to lay out defensive walls. By the 17th century, a brand new concept was realized, that of a citizen army. Before that, most armies were highly trained small groups of foreign mercenaries. Napoleon changed that with the implementation of a military draft of sorts, which could call millions of soldiers to duty in an instant. This, paired with the relatively easy use of musket, yet led to his almost complete takeover of Europe. Tactics of Napoleon included light infantry columns. Instead of training millions of farmers complex military strategies, he went for the brute force method. Each column had ridiculous depth that rivaled Greeks' phalanxes. A center line would unleash an initial volley, and then the two sides, in their column formation, would charge with all their force into enemy lines with bayonets. This alone would usually cause a total rout of enemy troops, which his cavalry would then clean up. The Franco-Prussian War would harken in a new age of warfare. As opposed to earlier conflicts, both sides would use bolt-action rifles, using cartridges instead of muzzle-loaded muskets. These new weapons proved to be accurate at over 1,000 meters. Because of this, the Germans were not capable of assaulting positions without unacceptable casualties due to the French riflemen. The generals at the time had no idea what to do other than just to sit back and try to flatten the target with artillery, and then send infantry to mop up the survivors. We will see this tactic tried again in a few years, with much less success. By the time World War I rolled around, war was sheer chaos. Generals on both sides continued trying to rush enemy lines in giant charges, but to no avail. With new technologies such as the machine gun, charges almost always failed, or suffered incredibly heavy casualties. As the war continued, the front lines became more and more bogged down. In the beginning, the trenches were small and shallow, only meant for temporary use, but when either side could not advance past them, they soon became huge networks of trenches and underground bunkers. The main strategy at the time was to try to obliterate the enemy trenches with artillery, and then send the infantry in to finish them off. But the enemy would usually hide deep within the trenches, and when the infantry push began, they would man machine guns and tear through the waves of enemy attackers. After many months of this, the generals finally realized that artillery alone was not going to win the war. Every component of the army must be used together to win battles. This concept was dubbed combined arms, and is still used today. World War II involved a whole new set of technologies and strategies never before seen. For example, World War II involved both strategic and tactical air warfare. Tactical air warfare was the use of planes to attack enemy's troops on the battlefield, usually in coordinated support of one's own troops. The heavy bomber was also used to conduct strategic air raids, most notably by the British and American forces in the war against Germany. The development of long-range aircraft made bombing raids deep into German-occupied Europe feasible, but daytime missions were dangerous, and night raids proved inaccurate and largely ineffective. The military value of paratroopers and glider troops was also first demonstrated in World War II. Airborne combat troops could be dropped behind enemy lines to seize or sabotage key positions and installations. As in World War I, submarines were a major menace to ships. German submarines used a wolf pack method of attack, where many of them would coordinate attacks together. Battleships were also used, but by the end of the war, with the invention of missiles, large cannon-mounted battleships were out of date. The most significant development in naval warfare in World War II was the use of aircraft carriers as capital ships, that is, as the main warships of the fleet. Before the war, aircraft carriers were generally viewed as support ships, intended to provide air protection and air reconnaissance for battleships. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor showed the carrier's potential as an offensive weapon. On land, tanks played a major role in the conflict. Tanks were designed to be independent offensive weapons. In the case of the Germans, the spirit of blitzkrieg tactics. They were fast fast low to the ground and heavily armed and armored. Some could reach top speeds of up to 30 miles per hour. One of the biggest advancements in weapon technology was the invention of the atomic bomb. A single warhead could level an entire city. By the end of the war, only the United States had access to the technology, but the Soviets soon followed. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union each built a stockpile of nuclear weapons. Soviet policy rested on the conviction that a nuclear war could be fought and won, while the United States adopted nuclear deterrence, the credible threat of retaliation to forestall enemy attack. Basically, that if the Soviets ever fired a nuke at America, they would retaliate before the nuke reaches its destination, and both countries would be screwed. Because each country had enough firepower to destroy the world, this put a lot of pressure on the superpowers to not start a full-on war. This led to some close calls such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that concludes our brief history of warfare. As a reward for sticking around until the end of this incredibly dense video, here's a clip of Dante trying to jump from a chair to a couch. Thanks for watching, guys.